Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Web Union, and in this one there are some advances by the Russians in the eastern section of the front line from the northern to the southern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Starting out in the southern parts of the Donetsk region, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold within Bahatyr. We see with this duplicate footage the Russians launched an armored assault towards the town. Some of these vehicles were struck outside of the town. The Russians managed to enter the town and gain a foothold within it. Now fighting is taking place both in the southern parts of the town and on the outskirts of the fortified positions. The Russians managed to secure two supply lines towards the town. Through the first lines to the south, there's a road that connects, a dead road that the Russians are using to supply from the southern flank, and a secondary highway connected to Korokhove to the east. The Russians are entering both of these roads towards the town, from which they now are fighting over a foothold and to consolidate their positions. We previously talked about the 4 stages of an assault. There's the initial assault, the IA, which has a high success chance, and as we can see here, the Russians succeeded with this initial assault. Now the second point is to consolidate their positions within the town. If they're able to consolidate, then they'll have to deal with the response of the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians will attempt to dislodge the Russians from their foothold and push them back out of the town, while also striking the supply lines. There's the intersection just south of the town that the Ukrainians will target as the main position. Then there are 2 towns from which the Russians will be supplying their forces, from Konstantinopel in the east and Rusliv to the south. If the Russians are able to consolidate the positions and deal with the Ukrainian response, then they can start offensive operations within the town to expand, cutting off the town from the fortified positions, or by storming the fortified positions directly from the south and from the east in a combined strike from both of these directions. The Russians are within close proximity from both directions. The Russians will here be looking to gain full control over Bahatyr as well as the fortified positions, the roads connecting Bahatyr with Rostolne to the south, Rusliv to the southeast, and Konstantinopel to the east. It will allow the Russians to continue offensive operations in the western direction towards Udaratne, Komar, and Pervodova in the rear of the fortified line of the Ukrainians northwest of Velika Novosilka. At the same time, it will also allow the Russians to pressure Oleksivka from the south. With the recent advances in the northern flank, the Russians may also expand their offensive operations there to flank Oleksivka from the north and storm it directly from the east for a 3-pronged attack from these separate directions. To the north, the Russians also managed to advance in the southern flank of Uspenivka, gaining control over the first line and road connecting Uspenivka to Nadivka to the south. It also gained full control over the first lines leading up to Novoalexandrivka. This allows the Russians to now have 2 roads connecting to Novoalexandrivka from the southeast and from the east. It will allow the Russians to start offensive operations to gain a foothold within the town and then go up the 4-step process to gain full control over the town, and then move on to the next one, which is Novoserhivka to the north, the fortified positions to the south, and Novomykolaivka to the west. The Russians have here secured the area between Uspenivka and Nadivka. This also fully secures Uspenivka for the Russian forces, as they now have several roads going into Uspenivka, and the Ukrainians only have 1 single road, which is now under complete fire control by the Russian forces. This makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to launch additional counterattacks. This also means that the Russians are able to build up their supplies within Uspenivka and in the nearby areas for future operations towards Novoalexandrivka, as well as in Novovasilivka, within the close proximity to the front line. The Russians also expanded their foothold within Udashne, where the fighting is taking place within the residential area following the Russian capture of the industrial area here to the southeastern outskirts of the town. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over Udashne to open up the road for offensive operations towards the coke mine here to the north, where they'll be looking to gain full control of it, securing the general area here west of Pokrovsk. It'll allow the Russians to secure Udashne, the mine itself, and Kotlina for further offensive operations in the northern direction to gain control over the fortified positions and cut off the road connecting Pokrovsk to the Dnipropetrovsk region, and also to expand in a westward direction, creating a buffer zone between the Russian positions in the western flank and the ones in the eastern flank, securing offensive operations in that direction, and also allowing the Russians to use that as a hub for further offensive operations into the Dnipropetrovsk region, where the Russians can start fighting over the supply logistical hubs for the Ukrainians, gain control over which will allow them to expand their offensive operations in a northwestern direction. We do notice that the Ukrainians have a few towns in the area. Beyond Kotlina and Udashne, there's the mine, and then there's Serhivka. Besides that, there's no settlements in between Udashne, Kotlina, and the highway to the north. This means that in the coming summer period, once the ground dries up, the Russians will have a significant advantage in launching offensive operations compared to the winter and spring seasons. To the east, the Russians have managed to advance here across the Serbets River line, gaining control over the remaining parts of Nove, as well as advancing down the main road south of Nove towards Liman. The Russians have here secured one that will be a logistical hub for their forces for further offensive operations both towards Ritkodub, here to the northwest, Lipove and Tselena Dolina to the south and west. This will secure the general area around the road for offensive operations in the southern direction toward Liman and in the northern direction towards Borova, and finally in a western direction towards Losove, where the Russians can cut off the connection between Borova and Liman in the eastern bank of the Oskar River line, and also offensive operations towards Century Lohove, which is one of the main connecting points between the Ukrainian positions in the eastern bank of the Oskar River line towards Liman, and connecting down further south towards Dobisheve and Novoselivka. The Russians will be able to cut off the three roads that connects Liman with the western bank of the Oskar River line and Izium. The Russians will here look to bypass Liman itself rather than storming it directly head on. We can also estimate that the Russians will not prioritize the southern or eastern parts of Liman, but will instead look to cut off Liman completely before attacking it directly head on. This will allow the Russians to cut off the supplies going into Liman from the western and northern directions, leaving only the southern and eastern flanks, where the Ukrainians would have to cross over the Seversko-Donetsk river line, where all of the bridges are already blown. This means they'll have to makeshift bridges to supply the forces within Liman. It will also strain the supplies in the eastern section of the Donetsk region. However, the Russians themselves also have their own river line to pass through. In the end, it'll be even in terms of supplies between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. However, isolating Liman will allow the Russians to attack it from three separate directions on a wide front, concentrating their fire in a smaller area, which is the city itself. Based on the recent advances we see across the front line, starting out from the north, we can see that the battle over Kupiansk is close. The Russians are looking to secure the supplies across the Oskar River line before attacking it directly head on, from which they can attack the supply lines from the northern flank and then move into the town itself. From the eastern and western banks of the river line, they are already grinding down the Ukrainian forces in the pocket on the eastern bank of the Oskar River line. To the south, the Russians have managed to advance and expand their bridgehead across the Serbets River line, where we'll likely see the Russians expanding their offensive operations here in the coming weeks, where they'll look to expand towards Borova, Losove, and Liman, where the Battle of Liman will start as well in the coming months. The Russians are also within close proximity to Siversk, as well as Chasiv. The fighting is nearing its end. Same with Toretsk in the southeast of Konstantinivka. This means that the Battle of Konstantinivka is also drawing closer. The Battle of Pokrovsk is also drawing very close. And from this we can see that the battle over the main towns and cities in the Donetsk region is very close and will take place this summer. On the political scene, a deal was signed between Ukraine and the United States. The minerals deal, which kept being delayed, has now been signed, and the deal itself is fairly balanced, setting the United States and Ukraine as equal partners when it comes to not just the minerals, but many other stuff, mainly connected to the reconstruction of Ukraine, where United States and Ukraine are equal partners. That also means they'll be sharing the profit that will be made. However, in the deal, it is also stated that within the first 10 years, no one is allowed to cash out. Instead, all of the profit goes re-enters the deal and re-enters the reconstruction fund. The Ukrainians are looking not just to receive cash from the United States, but also military equipment sent from the United States to Ukraine will be counted as cash, as well as technology sharing, equipment used to extract minerals or develop the country or rebuild the country. So the United States has a favorable point there where they can give anything and all of it will be counted towards the fund. and then they will be receiving profits after 10 years. However, the biggest winner is by far Ukraine, which gets a secure deal with the United States, not in terms of military guarantees, but in terms of the United States is now interested in Ukraine not just surviving the war, but also being rebuilt, as they would be able to gain massive profits from this deal. However, it requires Ukraine to survive the war and to hold as much territory as possible. So Ukraine thereby creates a common interest with the United States, and that is Ukraine surviving the war with as much territory as possible. This means the United States is now in a position where they can choose one of two things if the negotiations fall apart. One point would be to double down on sending aid to Ukraine. This would be Ukraine receiving a lot more aid so that they can regain some territory or achieve a favorable position to hold on as much territory as possible to prevent a full Russian capture of the country or a larger Russian capture of the country, but they'll hold as much of the minerals and natural resources as possible, as well as the land necessary to rebuild the country. The second option is that they can simply abandon Ukraine, and that is possible because there is no guarantees, there's no demands in the deal that requires the United States to do anything. Instead, the United States has no obligations whatsoever unless they want to receive some profits from this fund. This means that the United States can simply abandon Ukraine and they would have no consequences thereof in terms of this deal. In conclusion, the United States is keeping their options open. As long as they do not invest anything in this fund, then they have no stake or obligation to the outcome of this conflict. Instead, it also puts some sort of pressure on the Russians for them to make some sort of deal with the United States, because if the Russians also comes with an economic deal that the United States is interested in, then they can compete with this deal and turn the United States to option 2 rather than option 1. So even though it is unlikely that a peace settlement will be achieved between Russia and Ukraine, because it doesn't seem reasonable at all at the current situation, there is still some negotiations going on between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, just to influence the choice of Donald Trump towards option 1 or 2, because it is clear option 1 is very favorable to Ukraine in terms of their goals and ambitions, while option 2 is the best outcome for Russia, as Ukraine would lose a significant backer in this conflict. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.